I paid a professor at Chulalongkorn University $1,200 to review the ethnographic notes I'd been compiling for 18 months. I documented what I believed were rare Surin traditions, customs so localized and orally transmitted that Western anthropology had completely overlooked them. I'd spent $47,200 participating in these ceremonies, paying documentation fees to village elders, and supporting what I thought was legitimate anthropological fieldwork. Professor Siriwan Chamnankit read through my notes for 40 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up from the pages and said something that fractured my entire understanding of the previous year and 9 months. "Mr. Preston, I need to tell you something difficult. None of these traditions exist. Not in Surin, not anywhere in Thailand. Every single ceremony you've documented, every custom, every ritual, every village elder consultation is fabricated. You haven't discovered overlooked anthropological treasures. You've been systematically deceived." I'd met Kanya through an academic listserv. I wasn't looking for romance at 63. I was researching a book project on undocumented Southeast Asian cultural practices, comparing them to similar traditions in other agrarian societies. She responded to a post I'd made asking for contacts in rural Isaan, offering to introduce me to her family's village near the Cambodian border. Her English was excellent, peppered with academic vocabulary that suggested genuine educational background. When she mentioned her degree in tourism management from Kanya University, it seemed perfectly aligned with someone who could bridge cultural worlds. Our first meeting in Surin felt like an anthropological gift. Kanya didn't perform generic Thai girlfriend behaviors. She spoke about her region's history, about Khmer influences on Isaan culture, about how globalization was eroding oral traditions her grandmother's generation still practiced. She understood my research interests because she shared them. "My family knows customs that nobody writes about," she told me over coffee that first afternoon. "Traditions so specific to our village that even other Isaan people don't know them. If you want to document real culture, not tourist culture, I can help you." The academic in me recognized the gold mine. Here was primary source access, a cultural insider willing to facilitate ethnographic research in communities typically closed to foreign scholars. The loneliness in me, 3 years divorced, my adult children absorbed in their own lives, recognized something else. Kanya was attractive, yes, but more than that, she was intellectually engaging. We talked for 4 hours that first day about cultural preservation, about the ethics of anthropological observation, about whether documenting traditions changed their essential nature. By the time we said goodbye, we'd planned 3 research trips to her family's village. Romance developed slowly, almost accidentally, over those first few months. I was interviewing her grandmother about rice cultivation ceremonies. Kanya was translating, but she'd also add context, correct my misunderstandings about animist beliefs blended with Buddhist practice. One evening, after a particularly long interview session, we sat outside her family's house watching the sunset over rice fields. "You ask better questions than most anthropologists," she said. "You listen like you really want to understand, not just collect data." The comment touched something in me, the recognition that my academic curiosity was genuine, not extractive. When she took my hand that evening, it felt natural, like an extension of the intellectual intimacy we'd already built. The first cultural obligation emerged during my 3rd visit to her village. Her family was hosting a ceremony I'd never encountered in my research, something called a Quan rite for foreign guests. Kanya explained that when outsiders participated in village spiritual life, they needed to be formally welcomed by the community's eldest members to avoid disturbing the balance of collective Quan life essence. The ceremony required offerings to village spirits and a payment to the elder who would perform the welcoming ritual. "This is very rare custom," she said. "Only in our village, and maybe 2, 3 others near Cambodian border. Khmer-influenced. Very old tradition. The payment is not for the elder personally, it goes to maintain the spirit shrine that protects the village." The amount was 6,000 baht, about 135 pounds. In the context of anthropological fieldwork, it seemed entirely reasonable. I'd budgeted for research costs, and cultural protocol often required reciprocity. What made me immediately comply wasn't just the modest amount but Kanya's framing. She positioned the payment as methodologically essential to my research. If you don't participate correctly, the elders won't trust you with real information, she explained. They'll give you tourist version of traditions. But if you respect the Kwan ritual, they see you're serious scholar, not just curious foreigner. I paid the 6,000 baht. The ceremony was elaborate. The village elder, a weathered man who spoke no English, chanted over a complex arrangement of flowers and incense while tying white thread around my wrists. Other villagers watched with what appeared to be genuine reverence. Kanya translated the elder's words about welcoming my spirit into the village community, about the responsibilities I now held to honor their traditions by documenting them accurately. I felt moved, almost honored. This was exactly the kind of participant observation that produced genuine anthropological insight rather than armchair theorizing. That night, I wrote detailed field notes about the Kwan ceremony, sketching the arrangement of offerings, documenting the elders' gestures, recording everything Kanya had translated. I was proud of my growing cultural competency. I'd participated appropriately, respected local customs, established trust with community members. The 6,000 baht wasn't a loss. It was an investment in authentic research access. Over the following months, my cultural education deepened in ways that felt academically legitimate. Kanya introduced me to what she called documentation protocols, village customs, around recording sacred information. Before photographing certain ceremonies, I needed permission from a council of 3 village elders, granted through a formal request process that included a consultation fee of 8,000 baht. When I wanted to interview elderly community members about pre-Buddhist animist practices, there was a knowledge-sharing reciprocity payment of 5,000 baht per interview, compensating the community for sharing wisdom accumulated over generations. Each request seemed anthropologically sound. Indigenous communities worldwide have protocols around sacred knowledge. Compensation for cultural informants is standard ethnographic practice. The amounts weren't extravagant. We were talking about sums that seemed reasonable for rural villagers sharing carefully preserved oral traditions. What made me embrace these costs wasn't naivety about research expenses, but genuine belief that I was engaging ethically with a community that had been historically exploited by extractive scholarship. Kanya reinforced this framing constantly. Many anthropologists come, take information, publish books, make money, she told me. They give nothing back to community. But you're different. You respect that knowledge has value. That's why elders trust you. The validation was intoxicating. After decades teaching sociology at San Francisco State, conducting mostly theoretical research, here I was doing real field work, trusted by a community, because I understood reciprocity. I wasn't just another academic tourist, I was a respectful scholar engaging with genuine cultural preservation. By month 6, I documented 9 ceremonies I'd never encountered in any academic literature on Thai or Isaan culture. There was the border blessing ritual, performed when the village needed to maintain spiritual boundaries with neighboring communities, 12,000 baht for the ceremony costs plus documentation fees. There was the knowledge keeper succession ceremony, where younger villagers were formally recognized as tradition bearers, 15,000 baht to attend and record, because outsider observation required special spiritual preparation. There was the harvest dream interpretation gathering, where village women analyzed communal dreams to predict crop success, 10,000 baht consultation fee, because dream knowledge was particularly sacred. Each tradition came with historical context Kanya provided in impressive detail. She explained Khmer linguistic roots in ceremony names, described how these practices had survived despite Buddhist missionary efforts, connected current rituals to anthropological theories about animist belief systems in agricultural societies. Her explanations included exactly the kind of academic vocabulary that signaled genuine scholarly engagement. She referenced liminality in ritual space, discussed Victor Turner's concepts of communitas, mentioned parallels to practices documented in Cambodian villages across the border. I was documenting what I genuinely believed was groundbreaking ethnographic research. My field notes filled 3 notebooks. I'd shot over 400 photographs of ceremonies. I'd recorded 6 hours of audio interviews with village elders, all translated by Kanya, all providing rich detail about traditions supposedly passed down through 12 generations. The material was compelling enough that I'd started drafting early chapters of what I imagined would be a significant contribution to Southeast Asian anthropology, a documentation of localized customs that globalization would soon erase. The financial investment seemed entirely justified by the research value. When my department colleagues back in San Francisco asked how the fieldwork was progressing, I'd enthusiastically describe the unique traditions I was accessing, the trust I'd built with the Surin village community, the importance of documenting these practices before they disappeared. I'd posted on academic forums about the methodological challenges of ethnographic research with oral traditions, carefully not revealing too much detail before publication but emphasizing the significance of what I was uncovering. My relationship with Kanya had deepened alongside the research. We'd moved past the initial cultural guide and researcher dynamic into genuine partnership. She wasn't just facilitating my work, she was intellectually contributing to it, challenging my interpretations, adding layers of analysis I'd have missed on my own. When she suggested I should pay her a monthly research coordination fee of 25,000 baht to compensate for the time she was investing in translation, cultural mediation, and logistical coordination, it seemed entirely appropriate. Academic research assistants in Western institutions earned far more. I was getting full-time support from someone with genuine expertise in her own culture. By month 9, I'd spent approximately 193,000 baht on what I categorized in my research budget as cultural protocol costs, elder consultation fees, and documentation permissions. In pounds sterling, that was roughly 4,300. Expensive for fieldwork, certainly, but not unreasonable for 18 months of intensive primary research with extensive community access. I'd spent more on conference travel in previous years. The difference was that this money was producing what I believed was original, significant scholarly work. The ceremonies became increasingly elaborate and specific. Kanya introduced me to a tradition called ancestral documentation approval, where I needed to present my research intentions to a gathering of the village's eldest members, all those over 70, in a formal ceremony that required offerings and a 20,000 baht consultation payment. She explained this was necessary because some of the traditions I wanted to document involved knowledge transmitted from ancestors, and recording them required spiritual permission from those closest to the ancestral realm. The ceremony lasted 3 hours. 5 elderly villagers sat in a semicircle while I explained my research through Kanya's translation, describing my commitment to representing their traditions accurately, to publishing work that would preserve rather than exploit their cultural heritage. The elders conferred in Surin dialect, which Kanya said was too localized for her to translate completely, but that their discussion centered on whether my intentions were pure enough to receive ancestral approval. Finally, the eldest man, introduced as the village's primary spirit medium, placed his hand on my head and spoke words Kanya translated as granting permission, with the condition that I make additional offerings at specific ceremonial intervals. I wrote detailed notes about the approval ceremony, photographed the ritual arrangement, felt genuinely moved by what seemed like deep cultural engagement. This was anthropology as it should be practiced: respectful, participatory, approved by community gatekeepers rather than imposed by Western academic authority. The 20,000 baht felt like appropriate reciprocity for the extraordinary access I was receiving. The pattern continued for another 9 months. Each major documentation milestone required its own ceremony, its own consultation with village authorities, its own payment structure. When I wanted to photograph the most sacred ceremony, I'd yet encountered something Kanya called the 7-generation knowledge transmission rite. The cost was 35,000 baht, because the ritual required spiritual protection for both the participants and the observer. When I needed to verify certain historical details about ceremony origins, consulting the village's oral history keeper required a 15,000 baht knowledge access fee. The financial escalation felt proportional to the increasing significance of what I was documenting. Early ceremonies had been relatively common village practices. These later traditions were described as occurring only once or twice per generation, observed only by initiated community members, never previously witnessed by outsiders. That I was being granted access seemed like extraordinary privilege requiring extraordinary reciprocity. I wasn't just documenting culture, I was being trusted with sacred knowledge that communities had protected from external exploitation for centuries. By month 15, I drafted 6 chapters of my book manuscript. The material was rich, specific, unlike anything in existing literature on Thai cultural practices. I'd structured the work around the concept of localized cultural persistence, how micro-communities develop and maintain traditions so specific that they remain invisible to broader cultural surveys. The Surin village traditions I was documenting became my case study for challenging, homogenizing assumptions about Thai or Isaan culture. Not all Thai Buddhism looked the same. Not all Isaan animism followed identical patterns. These village-specific practices demonstrated cultural variation at the most granular level. I'd shared early drafts with 2 colleagues in Southeast Asian studies. Their feedback was encouraging but raised questions. One noted that several ceremony names Kanya had provided didn't appear in any Thai or Lao linguistic databases. Another mentioned that some of the ritual elements I described seemed inconsistent with documented Khmer cultural influences in the region. Both suggested I verify details with Thai academic experts before publication. Their concerns registered as methodological caution rather than red flags, peer review identifying areas needing additional sourcing rather than questioning the fundamental legitimacy of my research. Kanya had responses for every question. The ceremony names weren't in linguistic databases because they were dialect-specific to 3 villages, never studied by Thai linguists who focused on major language groups. The ritual elements seemed inconsistent because I was comparing them to Cambodian cultural practices rather than recognizing this specific border region's unique synthesis. She framed my colleagues' questions as exactly the problem with existing anthropological literature. Scholars imposed broader regional frameworks rather than recognizing hyperlocal variation. Her explanations were academically sophisticated enough that I accepted them. More than accepted them, I incorporated them into my manuscript as evidence of the very problem my research was addressing. Existing scholarship on Thai culture was inadequate because it overlooked precisely the kind of micro-traditions I was documenting. That other anthropologists hadn't encountered these practices didn't invalidate them. It revealed the limitations of previous research methods. By month 18, my financial investment in the research totaled approximately 410,000 baht, roughly £9,300. I'd paid for 17 major ceremonies, consultation fees for 24 elder interviews, documentation permissions for 6 sacred knowledge recordings, ongoing monthly coordination fees to Kanya, and numerous smaller cultural protocol costs. The amount was significant, but still within the range I'd budgeted for a multi-year research project that would likely produce both a book and multiple journal articles. I felt intellectually confident about the work. I'd followed anthropological best practices, participant observation, extensive field notes, photographic documentation, recorded interviews, cultural mediation through a trusted insider, appropriate reciprocity with community members. The ceremonies I'd witnessed were elaborate, clearly meaningful to participants, consistent in their internal logic. Village members treated them with genuine reverence. Everything about the research experience suggested authentic cultural engagement rather than staged performance. The small inconsistencies I'd noticed: ceremony dates that shifted without clear explanation, ritual elements that varied between supposedly identical traditions, elders who seemed to confer with Kanya before answering my questions, I rationalized as natural variation in oral traditions. Living culture isn't static. Practices evolve, adapt to circumstances, exist in multiple simultaneously valid forms. That's what made ethnographic research complex and valuable. If everything had been rigidly consistent, that would have suggested staged authenticity rather than genuine cultural practice. What I didn't recognize, what I couldn't see through my scholarly investment in the work's significance, was how perfectly Kanya had constructed a system to exploit precisely my intellectual vulnerabilities. She'd identified exactly what would make me trust without deep verification: academic framing, sophisticated cultural analysis, the appearance of scholarly rigor, the validation of being trusted with undiscovered knowledge. Every element of her manipulation was calibrated to appeal to my specific combination of anthropological training and ego investment in producing original research. The financial escalation happened so gradually, always justified by increasing access to more significant traditions, that I never stepped back to calculate the total or compare it to legitimate research costs. Each individual payment seemed reasonable in isolation. The pattern only became visible in aggregate, and I was too focused on documentation to track aggregate spending. I was thinking like an anthropologist collecting data, not like someone tracking financial exploitation. I'd changed my entire research focus to accommodate what I believed were Kanya's legitimate traditions. I'd spent 2 years I could have devoted to other projects. I'd used sabbatical funding, personal savings, and a small research grant, $47,200 total, on ceremonies I would later discover were entirely fabricated. But in month 18, I still believed I was engaged in legitimate, significant scholarly work that would establish my reputation in Southeast Asian anthropology. The ceremonies became more elaborate as my documentation progressed. Kanya introduced me to what she called the Elder Council's concern about my research. According to her translation, the village's 3 most senior elders, all over 80 years old, had gathered to discuss whether the knowledge I was documenting might be misused by outsiders who didn't understand its sacred context. They'd decided that, before I could proceed with documenting the most significant remaining traditions, I needed to participate in a knowledge-bearer ceremony that would formally recognize me as someone spiritually authorized to preserve these practices. The ceremony required elaborate preparation, Kanya explained. I needed to sponsor a feast for the entire village, roughly 120 people, which would cost 38,000 baht for traditional foods. I needed to make offerings at 4 different spirit shrines located at the village's cardinal directions, each requiring specific ritual objects totaling 18,000 baht. Most significantly, I needed to compensate the 3 elders for the time and spiritual energy required to perform the recognition ceremony, 25,000 baht each, 75,000 baht total. The total cost for this single ceremony was 131,000 baht, approximately 3,000 pounds. It was by far the most expensive cultural protocol I'd encountered, but Kanya framed it as the culminating validation of 18 months of research, the ceremonial recognition that would grant me access to the village's most protected traditions. Practices, she claimed, had never been witnessed by any outsider, Thai or foreign. After this ceremony, elders will share knowledge they haven't told their own children, she said. You'll document traditions that would die with them. This is not just research costs, this is cultural preservation. The academic significance she described was compelling. If I could document practices about to disappear with the last generation that preserved them, I'd be creating an irreplaceable ethnographic record. The cost seemed proportional to the scholarly value. I'd spent equivalent amounts attending conferences, traveling to archives, accessing specialized research resources. This was fieldwork at its most fundamental, primary observation of cultural practices at the moment before extinction. I paid the 131,000 baht. The knowledge-bearer ceremony was the most elaborate ritual I'd yet witnessed. The 3 village elders, wearing what Kanya identified as ceremonial clothing specific to their role as tradition keepers, performed chants in Surin dialect for over 2 hours. The entire village gathered, some watching, others participating in responsive chanting. Complex offerings were arranged and rearranged. At the ceremony's climax, the eldest elder placed a hand-woven cloth over my shoulders and spoke words. Kanya translated as recognizing me as a foreign knowledge keeper, authorized to preserve their traditions in written form. I recorded the entire ceremony, took extensive photographs, wrote 23 pages of field notes that night. The emotional weight of the experience felt genuine, the elders' reverence, the village community's participation, the sense of being honored with extraordinary trust. I felt the responsibility of accurate documentation, the obligation to represent these traditions with the care and respect they deserved. This wasn't just academic research anymore, it had become something closer to spiritual duty. In the weeks following the knowledge bearer ceremony, the elders supposedly shared traditions I'd never encountered in any context. Kanya translated complex explanations of dream interpretation systems used to diagnose community spiritual health. She described harvest blessing rituals that required observing specific celestial alignments, documented through oral astronomy passed down 12 generations. She detailed healing practices that combined Buddhist mantras with pre-Buddhist spirit negotiation techniques. Each tradition was elaborate, internally consistent, rich with the kind of specific detail that suggested genuine cultural depth rather than invented performance. But each tradition also required its own documentation protocol. Recording the dream interpretation system required a consultation fee of 22,000 baht, because the knowledge was considered spiritually potent enough to affect observers who didn't approach it correctly. Photographing the celestial observation practices required a 15,000 baht offering to the sky spirits whose patterns were being documented. Interviewing the village's traditional healer about spirit negotiation required a 28,000 baht knowledge transfer payment because healing knowledge was the most sacred category of community wisdom. The costs continued, escalating in proportion to the supposed significance of each tradition. By month 21, 1 year and 9 months into my research, I'd spent $47,200 on cultural protocols, elder consultations, documentation fees, and ceremony costs. In isolation from the research context, the amount was staggering. Within the framework Kanya had constructed that I was documenting irreplaceable cultural knowledge, that I was trusted with extraordinary access, that appropriate reciprocity required substantial financial compensation. Each payment had seemed not just reasonable but ethically necessary. I defended these costs to colleagues who'd raised concerns. When a fellow anthropologist mentioned that 28,000 baht for a single interview seemed excessive, I'd responded with a small lecture about the ethics of cultural compensation. We've exploited indigenous communities for generations by extracting knowledge without reciprocity, I'd argued. If properly compensating cultural informants is expensive, that reflects the actual value of what they're sharing, not researcher entitlement to free access. I'd been defensive, even self-righteous, about my willingness to pay what other researchers might consider inflated costs. I'd written forum posts about the importance of moving beyond extractive research models, about valuing indigenous knowledge systems enough to compensate them appropriately. I'd presented my research approach at a faculty seminar, emphasizing how my methodology centered community benefit rather than researcher exploitation. Multiple colleagues had cited my work as exemplary ethical fieldwork practice. My scholarly reputation was becoming connected to this research, both the empirical findings and the methodological approach. That investment, intellectual, professional, emotional, financial, made me vulnerable to the cognitive dissonance that emerged when small contradictions began accumulating. When I asked Kanya why certain ceremony dates had shifted with only 1 day's notice, she explained that the dates were determined by elder consultation with spirits, which couldn't be scheduled rigidly according to Western calendar logic. When I noticed that ritual elements she described as essential to specific ceremonies weren't present in subsequent performances, she said I was comparing different ceremony types that shared names but served distinct spiritual functions. Every anomaly had an explanation sophisticated enough to be plausible. Kanya never provided simplistic responses. Her answers referenced genuine aspects of animist belief systems, acknowledged real complexity in oral traditions, framed my questions as revealing my still developing understanding of non-Western knowledge systems. The framing positioned questioning as evidence of my incomplete cultural competency rather than legitimate scholarly verification. I wanted to be the kind of anthropologist who respected cultural complexity rather than imposing Western frameworks, so I accepted her explanations. The breakthrough, the moment when doubt finally overwhelmed rationalization, came in month 21, when I attempted to verify one specific ceremonial element independently. I documented a tradition Kanya called the Four Directions Knowledge Offering, where village elders stood at the cardinal points of a ceremonial space and recited different sections of a protective chant, simultaneously, creating what she described as a spiritual harmony that sealed sacred knowledge from spiritual interference. I'd found the practice fascinating and had written an entire chapter analyzing it through theories of sonic ritual and sacred geometry. But one element puzzled me. Kanya had said the chant was in ancient Khmer language that even modern Cambodians wouldn't recognize. Out of scholarly curiosity, I'd submitted a recording of the chant to a colleague who specialized in historical Southeast Asian linguistics, asking if she could identify any linguistic elements that might confirm the Khmer connection. Her response arrived after 3 weeks of analysis. "Walter, I've listened to this recording with 2 other Khmer linguistics experts. We're confident this isn't ancient Khmer. It's not Khmer at any stage of the language's documented development. Parts of it appear to be modern Isaan dialect, but arranged in non-grammatical sequences. Several sections are simply repetitive phonemes, with no semantic content in any language we can identify. Whatever this is, it's not a preserved ancient text. I'd need more context about where you recorded this to offer better analysis, but based purely on linguistic evidence, this doesn't appear to be a genuine traditional chant." I read her email 17 times. Each reading, the implications expanded. If the chant wasn't genuine, what did that mean about the ceremony where I'd recorded it? If the ceremony wasn't genuine, what did that mean about the cultural context Kanya had provided? If her cultural explanations weren't reliable, what did that mean about the 18 other ceremonies I documented based entirely on her translations and interpretations? I didn't immediately confront her. The academic in me wanted more data before drawing conclusions. I began systematically reviewing my field notes, looking for patterns I'd rationalized individually but might reveal something collectively. I started noticing how often elders would glance at Kanya before answering my questions, as if confirming the approved response. I noticed how ceremony costs had escalated precisely in proportion to my expressions of research enthusiasm when I described a tradition as potentially significant. The documentation fees increased. I noticed how village members who'd supposedly been performing these ceremonies for decades sometimes needed Kanya's whispered reminders about ritual sequence. The small inconsistencies I'd explained away as natural cultural variation began appearing as coordination failures in staged performances. The sophisticated cultural analyses I'd attributed to Kanya's genuine knowledge began seeming like she'd researched anthropological theory to construct believable explanations. The trust I'd felt from village elders began looking like payment for participation in elaborate deception. I spent 3 weeks conducting quiet research I should have done 18 months earlier. I contacted 4 different Thai anthropologists at universities in Bangkok and Chiang Mai, sending them my ceremony documentation and asking if they could provide context about these Surin traditions. I consulted published ethnographies of Isaan culture, searching for any mention of practices similar to what I'd documented. I posted carefully worded questions in academic forums about border region cultural practices, trying to find independent verification of these supposedly rare traditions. Every inquiry returned the same result. Nobody had encountered anything resembling the ceremonies I documented. 2 Thai anthropologists explicitly stated that several traditions I described had no precedent in any documented Surin or Isaan cultural practice. One researcher who'd spent 30 years studying Khmer-Thai border communities said the Four Directions Knowledge Offering sounded like a synthesis of elements from multiple different traditions, combined in ways that wouldn't make sense within actual Surin spiritual logic. The most damning response came from Professor Siriwan Chamnankit at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. I'd sent her my complete documentation, all my field notes, photographs, recordings, asking if she could provide historical context for publication. Her response email opened with professional courtesy but quickly shifted to uncomfortable directness. "Mr. Preston, I need to schedule a call to discuss your materials." The The traditions you've documented don't correspond to any authentic Surin or Isaan practices I'm aware of. Several ceremonies appear to be fabrications that incorporate recognizable cultural elements in ways that wouldn't occur in genuine practice. Before you proceed with publication, we need to discuss the possibility that you've been systematically deceived. I scheduled the video call for 3 days later. Those 72 hours were among the most psychologically destabilizing of my life. I couldn't focus on anything except reviewing my documentation with new eyes, seeing how perfectly Kanya had exploited my specific vulnerabilities, my desire to discover overlooked cultural practices, my investment in being an ethical anthropologist who respected indigenous knowledge, my pride in being trusted with supposedly sacred traditions. The call with Professor Surin lasted 2 hours. She'd reviewed my materials thoroughly, consulting with 2 other Thai cultural experts who specialized in Isaan traditions. Her assessment was devastating in its comprehensive demolition of my research foundation. She walked through my documentation systematically, ceremony by ceremony, explaining what was fabricated, what was distorted, what combined elements from unrelated traditions in ways that wouldn't occur naturally. The Quan rite for foreign guests you documented first, there's no such tradition in Surin. Quan ceremonies exist throughout Thailand and Laos, but they're performed for individuals experiencing spiritual imbalance, not for welcoming foreign researchers. The specific ritual structure you described combines elements from Maraban ceremonies with completely invented components. The village elder you paid would have been performing something created specifically for you, not preserving ancient tradition. She continued through my documentation with clinical precision. The border blessing ritual was fabricated, incorporating real spirit worship practices but invented for entirely non-existent purposes. The knowledge keeper succession ceremony combined elements of ordination rituals with made-up cultural content. The harvest dream interpretation gathering had no precedent in any documented Isaan spiritual practice. Dreams aren't interpreted collectively for agricultural prediction in traditional Surin culture. The most elaborate ceremony you documented, the knowledge bearer ceremony, appears to be an entirely invented ritual designed to extract maximum payment by creating the impression of exceptional honor and access. Nothing in Surin culture corresponds to foreign knowledge keepers or ceremonial authorization for documenting traditions. If village elders trusted you, they would simply share information. They wouldn't require expensive ceremonies first. Professor Surin's analysis addressed every major tradition I documented. None were genuine. Some incorporated recognizable elements of real Isaan or Khmer practices, but recombined them in ways that demonstrated creation rather than preservation. Many included invented terminology that sounded plausibly Southeast Asian, but didn't correspond to actual Thai, Lao, or Khmer linguistic patterns. The entire system I documented over 18 months was sophisticated cultural fabrication designed to appear authentic to someone with my specific knowledge gaps. The person who provided this information to you either doesn't actually understand Surin culture despite claiming regional origin, or more likely, deliberately constructed false traditions knowing you lacked the specific knowledge to verify them independently. I'm deeply sorry to tell you this, but you haven't been documenting undiscovered cultural practices. You've been documenting an elaborate deception. I asked Professor Surin the question I already knew the answer to. The $47,000 I spent on ceremony costs, consultation fees, documentation permissions, would any of that be legitimate expense for actual Surin cultural research? Her response was measured but clear. Legitimate research costs in rural Thai communities typically include compensation for informant's time, perhaps 200 to 500 baht per interview, sometimes more for particularly knowledgeable elders. You might provide meals when conducting lengthy interviews. If participating in actual ceremonies, small voluntary donations to temples or spirit shrines would be appropriate, typically 100 to 500 baht. For 18 months of intensive field work with multiple informants, legitimate research costs might total 20 to 30,000 baht, roughly 5 to 700 US dollars. What you describe paying is approximately 15 to 20 times what ethical, authentic research would cost. The vast majority of your expenses appear to have been payments for fabricated ceremonies and invented cultural obligations. After the call ended, I sat motionless for 40 minutes, staring at my laptop screen, trying to process the complete dissolution of 18 months of work. Every ceremony I'd documented with such care was fake. Every tradition I'd analyzed with such scholarly attention was invented. Every cultural insight I'd developed with such intellectual satisfaction was built on deliberately constructed deception. The book manuscript I'd drafted 6 chapters totaling 48,000 words was an elaborate anthropological fiction I'd written under the impression it was rigorous ethnography. The financial loss was significant but not catastrophic. $47,000 was painful but wouldn't destroy my retirement security. The intellectual loss was far more devastating. I'd invested 2 years of scholarly work, used sabbatical time I could have devoted to legitimate research, built professional presentations around a methodology that had been completely undermined by failure to verify basic claims. The emotional loss was perhaps worse. The trust I'd felt, the honor of being supposedly recognized as a knowledge keeper, the pride in thinking I'd discovered overlooked cultural treasures, all revealed as manipulation of my vanity and naivety. I didn't immediately confront Kanya. I spent another week conducting additional verification, hoping somehow Professor Surin had been wrong, that there might be some explanation that preserved at least partial legitimacy of my research. I contacted a second Thai cultural expert who provided nearly identical assessment. I searched through specialized academic databases for any mention of the ceremony names. Kanya had provided nothing. I posted in regional anthropology forums asking about specific ritual elements, no recognition from dozens of Southeast Asian specialists. Every verification attempt reinforced the same conclusion. The cultural system I documented was elaborate fiction. The only remaining question was whether Kanya had herself been deceived by village members or had knowingly constructed the deception from the beginning. Given her sophisticated use of anthropological vocabulary, her careful calibration of explanations to my specific knowledge gaps, her consistent ability to provide plausible responses to every question, deliberate fabrication seemed far more likely than innocent transmission of false information. I finally arranged to meet her at a cafe in Surin, neutral territory rather than her family's village. I brought printouts of Professor Surin's analysis along with my own documentation of failed verification attempts. When I arrived, Kanya was already there, greeting me with the warm smile that had characterized our entire relationship. The cognitive dissonance between her apparent affection and the evidence of systematic deception was psychologically jarring. I placed the documentation on the table between us. I consulted with Professor Surin at Chulalongkorn University about the traditions we've been documenting. She reviewed everything, all the ceremonies, all the cultural explanations you provided, all the ritual elements I photographed. She says none of it is authentic Surin or Isaan culture. She says the traditions I've been documenting don't exist. Kanya's expression shifted through several stages. Initial surprise, then hurt, then something harder. You asked Bangkok professor about Surin culture? Bangkok people don't understand Isaan. They think we're all same, all simple farmers with no unique traditions. This is exactly the problem I told you about. Urban Thai academics don't respect rural culture. I'd anticipated this response, the claim that academic experts were out of touch with localized practices. I pulled out my second set of documentation. I also consulted Professor Anong Fechabun at Kanya University. She's from Isaan, specializes in Isaan cultural practices specifically. She says the same thing. The ceremonies I documented don't correspond to any authentic Surin traditions. I spoke with researchers at Ubon Ratchathani University. Same assessment. The linguistic analysis of ceremony chants shows they're not ancient Khmer or any other historical language. They're modern phoneme sequences with no semantic content. Her defense mechanism shifted. Maybe my family practices are different from what professors know. Culture isn't one single thing. My grandmother's village has traditions that I spoke with your grandmother directly. I hadn't, actually, but I watched her face carefully as I claimed it. Through a translator who isn't connected to you. She said there's no Quan right for foreign guests. She said there's no knowledge-bearer ceremony. She looked confused when I asked about border blessing rituals and harvest, dream interpretation gatherings. Either your grandmother is lying about her own culture, or the traditions you've been describing to me don't exist. That detail, the fictional conversation with her grandmother, broke something in her defensive structure. The careful cultural explanations stopped. Her face went blank, calculating, deciding how to respond when the elaborate framework had collapsed. The ceremonies were real, she tried. Maybe names are wrong translation from Surin dialect. Maybe I explain them different from how Bangkok professors would. But village did perform them. You saw them yourself. Village members performed ceremonies you paid them to perform, based on instructions you provided, for events you scheduled around my research availability. That's not preserving traditional culture. That's staging elaborate performances for someone you knew couldn't verify whether they were genuine. She didn't respond immediately. I continued, pulling out financial documentation I'd prepared. I've calculated what I paid over 18 months. $47,200 for ceremony costs, consultation fees, and documentation permissions. Professor Siriwan says legitimate research costs for this work would be approximately $700. I paid you 67 times what authentic Surin cultural research should cost. Either every other anthropologist who's worked in this region is massively underpaying, or you've been systematically extracting money by fabricating traditions you knew I couldn't independently verify. Kanya was silent for a long moment, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted completely, the warmth gone, replaced with flat pragmatism. You wanted to discover secret traditions nobody else knew about. You wanted to be special researcher who found what other anthropologists missed. I gave you what you wanted. You felt honored, you felt trusted, you felt like important scholar. You got what you paid for. The statement was startling in its naked acknowledgement. No more cultural explanations, no more defensive appeals to regional variation or academic limitations. Just the cold logic of exploitation. I'd wanted something specific. She'd provided it. The transaction was complete. None of it was real, I said, needing to hear her confirm it explicitly. Some was real. The village exists. Buddhism exists. Spirit worship exists. I just arranged them differently for you, made them more special than they really are. You wanted special, so I gave you special. You're a professor, you understand this. You tell students that culture is constructed, that traditions are invented, that authenticity is just story people agree on. I constructed culture for you. You agreed to the story. The argument was perverse, using postmodern anthropological theory to justify fabricating the very traditions I was trying to document. But beneath the intellectual distortion was admission. She'd knowingly created false cultural practices, deliberately exploited my academic interests and ego, systematically extracted money through invented ceremonies and fabricated traditions. I asked the question that had haunted me since Professor Siriwan's assessment: how many of the ceremonies were completely made up versus distortions of real practices? She shrugged. Does it matter? You can't use any of it now. Real, fake, mixed, all of it is useless for your book. The data is contaminated. That's what matters for your career, right? Not whether village performed real ceremony or fake ceremony, only whether you can publish it. The coldness with which she assessed the destruction of my research was somehow more painful than the financial exploitation. This hadn't been a relationship that evolved into manipulation. It had been methodical deception from the beginning, calculated to exploit a specific target with specific vulnerabilities. She'd researched anthropological theory to construct believable fake traditions. She'd studied my research interests to create customs that perfectly aligned with my scholarly focus. She'd manipulated village members into performing elaborate ceremonies for someone who'd pay substantially more than authentic cultural participation would cost. The $47,000, where did it actually go? I asked. Some to village people for participating in ceremonies, some to me for organizing and translating, some for actual costs, food for gatherings, materials for ritual objects. but mostly to me, because I did all the work of creating your special culture for you. The admission was delivered without apology or shame. She'd performed a service fabricating an elaborate cultural system and been compensated for it. That the service was fundamentally fraudulent didn't seem to register as morally relevant. I'd wanted something, she'd provided it, money exchanged hands, transaction complete. I gathered my documentation, preparing to leave. I'll be sharing this experience with the anthropology community. Other researchers need to know about this kind of manipulation. For the first time in the conversation, something like concern crossed her face. You'll tell people I lied about Thai culture? That's not good for me. You did lie about Thai culture. Extensively, systematically, for 18 months. That's exactly what I'll be telling people. She was quiet for a moment then. Tell them I lied about my family's special traditions. Tell them I exaggerated regional customs. But don't tell them Thai culture is fake or Thai people are liars. That's not fair to everyone else. I'm one person who made bad choice. Don't make it about all Thai culture. The distinction requesting I frame this as individual deception rather than cultural pattern was the only moment in our conversation where something like ethical awareness appeared. She understood the difference between personal fraud and cultural stereotype. She was asking me to maintain that distinction even while exposing what she'd done. I left the cafe, walked back to my hotel, and spent the evening reviewing my field notes one final time before discarding them. Every page represented hours of careful observation, documented with scholarly precision, recording elaborate fabrications designed to exploit my scholarly ego and cultural ignorance. The intellectual devastation of recognizing that comprehensive failure was worse than the financial loss, worse than the romantic betrayal, worse than the embarrassment of having been so thoroughly deceived. The broader implications emerged gradually over the following weeks. I had to inform my department that the sabbatical research had produced no publishable material. I had to withdraw the conference presentation I'd scheduled about ethical anthropological methodology, since my actual methodology had been catastrophically inadequate. I had to contact colleagues who'd cited my work as exemplary and explain that it was built on systematic deception I'd failed to detect. The professional consequences weren't career-ending. I was senior enough, established enough, that one failed research project wouldn't destroy my reputation, but they were humiliating in public in ways that forced me to confront exactly how my pride had enabled exploitation. I also had to reckon with how my scholarly framework had made me vulnerable. I'd internalized critiques of extractive anthropology so completely that I'd become vulnerable to exploitation through appeals to research ethics. Kanya had weaponized the language of cultural reciprocity, indigenous knowledge compensation, and anti-colonial methodology to justify what were actually invented ceremonies requiring excessive payment. My desire to avoid being an exploitative Western researcher made me unable to recognize when I was being exploited by a non-Western research subject. The warning signs had been present from the beginning: ceremonies that conveniently required payment before observation, cultural explanations that always positioned questioning as disrespectful Western thinking, documentation protocols that prevented independent verification, ritual elements that never appeared in academic literature despite supposedly being practiced for generations, costs that escalated precisely in proportion to my research enthusiasm, village members who needed subtle direction from Kanya before performing supposedly ancient traditional ceremonies. Every single red flag had been present, but I'd rationalized each one through anthropological theory about cultural complexity, oral tradition variation, post-colonial methodology, and the limitations of existing scholarship. I'd been so invested in the significance of what I was discovering that I couldn't acknowledge the possibility that I was discovering elaborate fiction rather than overlooked cultural treasures. The financial audit was straightforward to reconstruct from my research expense records. I'd paid $47,200 over 18 months for fabricated ceremonies and invented cultural obligations. Professor Surin estimated legitimate research costs for equivalent fieldwork would be approximately $700 less than 2% of what I actually paid. The exploitation premium was roughly $46,500, money extracted through systematic invention of cultural obligations, calibrated to exploit my academic interests and methodological guilt about researcher privilege. The psychological manipulation was more sophisticated than simple financial fraud. Kanya had created an elaborate system that appealed to my specific combination of scholarly expertise and blind spots. She'd used real anthropological vocabulary, referenced genuine cultural elements, incorporated actual Isaan practices, all while distorting, exaggerating, or completely fabricating the specific traditions I was documenting. The sophistication of the deception suggested either extensive research on her part or previous experience exploiting academic researchers. I consulted with Thai academic colleagues about whether this kind of manipulation was common in anthropological fieldwork. The consensus was that while fabrication of cultural information occasionally occurs, systematic invention of elaborate ceremony systems over 18 months was exceptionally rare. Most research deception involves informants exaggerating their knowledge or presenting hearsay as personal experience, relatively minor distortions that careful verification catches. Kanya had constructed something far more elaborate, an entire cultural framework with internal consistency, performed by multiple community participants, sustained over nearly 2 years, designed specifically to exploit an academic researcher's inability to independently verify localized oral traditions. Several Thai anthropologists I consulted expressed concern that sharing my experience might reinforce stereotypes about Thai culture or make researchers inappropriately suspicious of legitimate cultural informants. Their concern was valid. The line between necessary scholarly verification and racist skepticism of non-Western knowledge claims is delicate. But the counter-argument, which Professor Surin articulated clearly, was that protecting researchers from this kind of exploitation required publicly acknowledging that it exists. Pretending cultural fabrication never happens doesn't protect Thai culture, she said. It just leaves vulnerable researchers without warnings about specific manipulation patterns to watch for. The red flag analysis became the most useful product of the failed research. I documented the specific warning signs I'd missed, organized them by category, and shared them with anthropology colleagues. Authority signals. When a cultural informant positions themselves as sole legitimate source of cultural knowledge, particularly claiming that other members of their community don't truly understand traditions only they can verify independently, Kanya had consistently framed herself as uniquely positioned to interpret village traditions, suggesting even other Surin people wouldn't understand the specific practices her family preserved. When cultural explanations use sophisticated academic vocabulary that seems calibrated to your specific theoretical knowledge, verify independently. Kanya's references to liminality, communitas, and post-colonial critique were sophisticated enough to seem credible but always deployed to shut down questioning rather than facilitate deeper analysis. When an informant discourages you from learning the local language or consulting other cultural experts, claiming it will contaminate your access to authentic traditions, immediately consult other experts. Kanya had subtly discouraged me from developing Thai language skills beyond basic conversational level, suggesting deep Surin dialect was too difficult, and that learning standard Thai would bias me toward Bangkok cultural perspectives. Financial patterns. When every significant cultural engagement requires substantial payment, framed as necessary reciprocity or ethical compensation, verify whether payment norms are actually typical for the region. I'd paid for 17 major ceremonies over 18 months. Legitimate Isaan cultural participation might include occasional voluntary donations, but not mandatory ceremony fees for every observation. When cultural costs escalate precisely in proportion to your expressed research interest, you're being exploited. I'd noticed that whenever I described a tradition as particularly significant or academically valuable, the documentation fees increased. That correlation should have been a warning rather than rationalized as reflecting legitimate cultural valuation. When payment structures prevent you from comparing costs with other researchers, verify independently with anthropologists working in the same region. Kanya had framed my research as uniquely intensive, suggesting other researchers didn't achieve comparable access precisely because they weren't willing to invest financially in appropriate cultural reciprocity. Verification resistance. When questioning cultural claims is consistently labeled as disrespectful, Western-centric thinking, or evidence of insufficient cultural understanding, question harder. Real cultural experts welcome questions because they deepen understanding. Fabricators need to prevent questioning because verification exposes deception. When an informant provides elaborate explanations for why traditions you're documenting don't appear in existing academic literature, independently verify the explanation. Localized practices unrecognized by broader scholarship do exist, but they shouldn't be completely absent from all regional documentation, while simultaneously requiring substantial payment for every observation. When ceremony dates, ritual elements, or cultural details change without clear explanation, and your questions about inconsistency are deflected, document the pattern. Oral traditions do vary, but systematic inconsistency suggests invention rather than organic cultural variation. Convenient cultural complications. When traditions become progressively more elaborate and specific, exactly in alignment with your research interests, verify that you're documenting existing culture rather than co-creating it through your questions. I'd asked about dream interpretation practices, and Kanya had subsequently discovered that her village had elaborate communal dream analysis traditions requiring expensive documentation fees. When cultural obligations conveniently align with maximum benefit to your informant, verify with other community members. Kanya's claim that research coordination required monthly payment of 25,000 baht wasn't rooted in any Surin cultural norm about compensation. It was a salary structure imported from Western academic contexts. When you're granted access to traditions supposedly restricted to initiated community members, and that access requires payment, verify whether restriction and payment norms are legitimate. Authentic sacred knowledge is often restricted, but the restriction isn't typically removed through financial payment to a single informant. Social isolation. When an informant suggests other expats or researchers don't understand real culture, discouraging you from comparing experiences, immediately compare experiences. Kanya had subtly positioned other foreign researchers as exploitative or superficial, suggesting my willingness to pay for appropriate cultural access distinguished me from typical extractive scholarship. When your primary information about a culture flows through a single person who mediates all community interactions, develop independent relationships with other community members. My dependence on Kanya's translation and cultural interpretation meant I had no independent verification mechanism for anything she told me. Performance indicators. When community members appear to need prompting or correction during supposedly traditional ceremonies, question whether you're observing authentic practice or staged performance. I'd noticed village members sometimes looking to Kanya for guidance during rituals, but I'd rationalize this as variation in personal knowledge rather than coordination of fabricated performance. When ceremony participants seem uncomfortable or uncertain rather than confident in traditional practice, investigate further. Genuine cultural practitioners performing familiar traditions demonstrate ease and confidence. Hesitation and uncertainty suggest unfamiliarity or invention. The actionable advice I developed focused on verification protocols every anthropological researcher should implement, regardless of how trustworthy cultural informants seem. Before major financial commitment. Step 1. Consult regional academic experts. Contact universities in the research region. Explain the traditions you're encountering. Ask whether they correspond to documented cultural practices. If practices are supposedly widespread but completely unknown to regional scholars, investigate further before paying substantial costs. I should have consulted Thai anthropologists after the first few ceremonies rather than waiting until I'd invested 18 months and $47,000. Step 2. Learn basic language skills. Develop enough linguistic capability to understand when your informant's translations might be distorted or fabricated. Cultural manipulation is harder when researchers can independently comprehend some direct communication with community members. My reliance entirely on Kanya's translation made independent verification impossible. Step 3. Establish cost reference points. Research typical payments for cultural informants in the region where you're working. Consult published anthropological literature. Contact researchers with fieldwork experience. Ask multiple informants about standard compensation. If your costs significantly exceed regional norms, investigate why rather than rationalizing through ethics frameworks. Step 4. Require multiple independent informants. Never rely solely on one person for all cultural information, regardless of their claimed expertise or community position. Authentic cultural knowledge exists across multiple community members. If only one person can explain supposedly widespread traditions, those traditions may not actually be widespread. Step 5. Document everything with verification timeline. Create detailed records of all cultural claims, payments, and ceremony observations with specific dates and contexts. Establish a verification timeline before publication specific points where you'll independently check claims before committing to their accuracy in scholarly work. During research, Step 1. Systematically verify major claims. Don't wait until research is complete to verify accuracy. Establish regular verification checkpoints where you consult external experts about what you're documenting. If I'd consulted Professor Surin after 6 months rather than 18, I'd have saved $30,000 in a year of wasted work. Step 2. Track financial escalation patterns. Monitor whether costs increase in proportion to your research enthusiasm. If every time you express academic interest in a tradition, the documentation fees escalate, you're being exploited rather than engaging in legitimate cultural reciprocity. Step 3. Observe without your informant. Present attempt to witness cultural practices without your primary informant's mediation. If practices only occur when your informant is present to orchestrate them, question their authenticity. Genuine traditions should exist independently of any single person's coordination. Step 4. Compare notes with other researchers. Actively seek out other anthropologists, expat community members, or foreign researchers working in the same region. Compare experiences, share cultural claims you're documenting, ask whether others have encountered similar traditions. Isolation from comparative perspectives enables manipulation. Step 5. Trust inconsistency discomfort. When cultural details don't quite align, when explanations feel too perfectly tailored to your questions, when ceremony timing seems suspiciously convenient, trust that discomfort. Document specific inconsistencies rather than immediately rationalizing them through theories of cultural complexity. If you suspect manipulation. Step 1. Pause all financial commitments. Stop paying for cultural access until you've verified basic claims independently. Legitimate cultural informants will understand appropriate scholarly verification. Those fabricating information will pressure you to continue paying before verification. Step 2. Consult cultural experts with your complete documentation. Send all your field notes, photographs, recordings, and financial records to established scholars specializing in the region's culture. Request comprehensive assessment of whether what you're documenting corresponds to authentic traditions. Be prepared for uncomfortable feedback. Step 3. Interview community members independently. If possible, consult community members without your primary informant present, using an independent translator. Ask about specific traditions you've documented. Observe whether descriptions match what you've been told or reveal discrepancies. Step 4. Verify financial norms. Specifically, ask multiple sources what typical costs are for cultural participation, elder consultations, and ceremony attendance. Compare your actual expenses to regional norms. Calculate exploitation premium if substantial discrepancy exists. Step 5. Prepare for uncomfortable truths. Accept that discovering manipulation means losing months or years of research work. The temptation to preserve research investment by ignoring evidence of deception is strong but professionally destructive. Better to acknowledge failure early than to build entire publications on fabricated data. The educational framework I developed emphasized that cultural manipulation isn't unique to Thailand. isn't typical of Thai culture and shouldn't reinforce stereotypes about Southeast Asian people. What Kanya did was individual fraud, sophisticated and calculated, but not representative of cultural norms. The vast majority of Thai people, anthropological informants in Thailand, and cultural experts operate with integrity. The danger lies in assuming cultural manipulation never happens, or that vigilance against it represents cultural disrespect. The cultural re-education process took months. I enrolled in formal Thai language courses at a university in Chiang Mai, developing skills I should have acquired before beginning fieldwork. I read extensively in anthropological literature on Isaan culture, discovering what authentic regional traditions actually involve. I interviewed multiple cultural experts about legitimate Surin practices, learning which elements of Kanya's fabrications were distorted real traditions versus complete inventions. The genuine cultural knowledge I gained after the deception was discovered revealed how thoroughly she'd manipulated my ignorance. Real Isaan spirit worship practices do exist. They're beautiful, meaningful, deeply rooted in animist worldviews that predate Buddhism, but they don't require elaborate payment structures for observation. Real sin-sod traditions involve negotiation and family discussion, not invented ceremony fees. Real village elders share cultural knowledge through conversation and relationship, not through paid consultation hierarchies. What Kanya had done was take recognizable elements of authentic Thai culture, spirit shrines, Quan ceremonies, elder respect, Buddhist merit-making, and recombine them into elaborate fabrications that sounded plausible to someone without detailed regional knowledge. The sophistication lay in calibrating the deception to my specific blind spots. She'd researched enough anthropological theory to construct culturally believable inventions while exploiting my methodological commitment to avoid extractive scholarship. The philosophical reckoning was perhaps the most intellectually challenging aspect of recovery. Kanya had used postmodern anthropological theory against me, the idea that culture is constructed, that traditions are invented, that authenticity is narrative rather than essential truth. She'd taken theoretical frameworks I'd taught for decades and weaponized them to justify fabricating the very cultural practices I was trying to document. The perverse intellectual sophistication of using my own theoretical commitments to exploit me was darkly brilliant. But the conclusion I eventually reached was that cultural constructivism doesn't justify cultural fraud. Yes, traditions are invented, but they're invented through genuine community practice over generations, not fabricated by an individual to exploit a researcher's naivety. Yes, culture is performed, but authentic performance differs fundamentally from staged deception designed to extract money. Yes, anthropological observation inevitably changes what's being observed, but that's different from deliberately creating what's being observed then claiming it's preserved tradition. The belief systems Kanya had manipulated me through respect for indigenous knowledge, commitment to research ethics, desire to avoid colonial extraction remained valuable. The error wasn't in holding those commitments, but in allowing them to prevent basic verification. Cultural respect and scholarly rigor aren't contradictory. Appropriate compensation for informants and vigilance against financial exploitation aren't incompatible. The lesson wasn't to become cynical about cultural engagement, but to recognize that manipulation can dress itself in the language of ethics. My current relationship with Thai culture, 3 years after the deception, is more complex and honestly more respectful than during my period of false expertise. I recognize the genuine beauty of traditions I'd distorted through fabricated overlay. I appreciate the real complexity of Isaan cultural practices without needing to discover secret variations that prove my scholarly uniqueness. I understand my position as an outsider with inherent limitations, rather than imagining I'd achieve special insider status through financial investment. I still believe cross-cultural anthropological research is valuable. I still believe researchers have obligations to compensate informants appropriately and engage respectfully with communities they study. But I've integrated the hard lesson that respecting culture requires verifying culture, that ethical methodology includes systematic fact-checking, that trust needs to be balanced with scholarly rigor, regardless of how trustworthy informants seem. The financial loss, was $47,200. The intellectual loss was 2 years of research that produced no legitimate scholarly output. The professional loss was substantial embarrassment and the need to rebuild methodological credibility with colleagues. But the most significant loss was perhaps the psychological one, the confrontation with my own vulnerability to manipulation when it appealed to exactly the self-image I most wanted to maintain. To anyone conducting anthropological fieldwork, particularly in regions where language barriers limit independent verification, cultural manipulation of researchers exists. It's rare, but it's real. The solution isn't cynicism about cultural informants or abandoning commitments to research ethics. The solution is implementing systematic verification protocols that balance cultural respect with scholarly rigor. Trust, but verify. Compensate fairly, but know what fair means. Respect traditions, but confirm they're actually traditions rather than elaborate performances created specifically for you. Real culture can withstand verification. Real traditions don't crumble under questioning. Real cultural experts welcome scholarly investigation because it deepens understanding rather than exposing fabrication. If an informant responds to verification attempts with defensiveness, accusations of disrespect, or claims that questioning demonstrates insufficient cultural competency, verify harder, because legitimate cultural engagement can tolerate rigorous examination. Only manipulation requires preventing verification. I learned what actual Surin cultural practices involve the genuine traditions Kanya had distorted beyond recognition. I learned what appropriate anthropological costs are in rural Thai communities. I learned how to distinguish authentic cultural variation from systematic fabrication. And I learned, painfully but valuably, that intellectual sophistication doesn't protect against manipulation that appeals to specific intellectual vanities. The warning I offer other researchers is this: the most dangerous cultural manipulation isn't crude exploitation that's easily recognized. It's sophisticated deception that appeals to your best methodological commitments, that validates your scholarly aspirations, that positions you as the exceptional researcher who understands what others miss. That kind of manipulation succeeds precisely because it makes you feel respected, trusted, honored, all while systematically exploiting the pride that prevents you from questioning whether you're documenting real culture or co-creating elaborate fiction. Belief systems are tools. Culture is constructed. Traditions are performed. But those theoretical truths don't justify fabricating traditions to exploit someone's desire to discover them. The line between cultural complexity and cultural fraud exists. Learning to recognize that line, maintaining verification practices that identify when it's being crossed, protecting yourself against manipulation without becoming cynically disrespectful, that's the balance every cross-cultural researcher must develop. I paid $47,000 to learn that lesson. The price was high, but the knowledge is permanent.